How's it going today, my friends? What is up with my peeps from the East Coast, the West Coast, other coasts, other countries around the world? Never did I think I would be able to discuss things like this with a whole variety of different cultures and people. When I started getting comments on my subscriptions years ago, and somebody says they live in a different country, I was like, oh, I didn't realize YouTube was, that they didn't have their own YouTube over there. And as time goes on, we've all learned a lot from each other through this interaction. And one of the biggest, I think, I should say, kind of, I don't want to say new age, because it's not new age, but that tends to be the label it's given. Ideas is about, well, self-awareness. And right when I was about to say that, I thought of mindfulness, because mindfulness has been a very popular term over the past maybe couple years mostly. Before that, it was meditation. It could have been TM, transcendental meditation. But self-awareness, it's something that we strive for. And what I mean by that is being aware of how we're perceived by others, and our strengths and our faults, and acknowledging, why we are the way we are. Now, here's the interesting thing I've learned, and what I'm here to share is that sometimes we go about it the wrong way, and that self-awareness is not what we should be seeking. Now, Freud, for example, who, for the good and the bad, Freud had this concept, Freudian psychology, that, everything was based on something that happened in our childhood. Tell me about your mother, right? Well, the problem with this approach is that sometimes self-awareness means that we go back and we look into our younger lives to find out what's wrong with us now. And we ask why. Why am I this way? Or why can't I do this? Or why do I do this? It's the wrong approach, I believe. I really do. I think that, and I went through this with somebody who was trying to figure out their situation, and I remember telling them, hey, don't look too far in your past, because you're here in your present and you're moving into the future. You're not going to address, because the problem of addressing why, even if you figure it out, even if you find out why you are the way you are, or something that happened to you in your childhood, or a circumstance of your upbringing, it doesn't tell you how to change it. It doesn't tell you how to act to properly overcome that obstacle in your life. So don't ask why, ask how, and how can I change? But that's very difficult, because none of us can really see ourselves as we are. Nobody can. YouTube and sharing things with all of you, it's helped me so much to understand more about, when I say something that's bullshit, I get called out on it, right? So in past years, I was much less careful about what I would say. 6 years ago, I was talking about, the occult and metaphysics, and that we all have this inherent power. I had this belief system in a way that we had, more power as individuals. Then I realized over time, even if we have that power, it doesn't matter. We don't need it. What we need is the power to understand ourselves, because the more you understand yourself, the better you understand the world around you. And at the very least, the better you can interact with other people. And so the question is, we all have kind of a rough side, I guess, to us, and that rough side can be very beneficial. It's something that I've learned through my own self-awareness. And I am kind of resistant and cynical about certain things. I tend to be a little bit gruff, or, rough around the edges about certain subjects, and sometimes I'm very stubborn. I have a very stubborn disposition when it comes to things I don't want to do. And at the same time, I try to justify those in my mind and think, am I acting appropriately? And my wife always calls me out on this, because I'll just say, no, I'm not doing this, or not going to this, or I don't want to do this. And then I'll start thinking, I'll start researching it somehow and thinking, reading articles. And I really love reading psychology and science articles about, why we think the way we do, because even though they are flawed in many ways, many of them tend to be, obvious. Many of these psychological traits of us can be, can truly be measured to an extent that we could say, oh, I'm acting that way, and this is the result for most people when they act that way. In other words, if you're a selfish asshole all your life, you're going to be miserable. By looking at the science and psychology behind rich people, we find out that being rich doesn't make you any happier than being poor. And that actually confused a lot of people. Like, well, I can't believe that. How can that be true? The realization that what we're looking for is in here, not in your wallet. And nobody sees the world objectively, okay? Nobody sees it for what it is. There's not one person on earth that's ever lived, or that will ever live, or that lives now, that sees the world as it actually is. Every one of us is designed to see light in a certain way, to hear certain frequencies of sounds and not others, to only feel certain vibrations and textures, and to only understand certain levels of awareness about the world and the self. So the idea that some people are just, well-rounded enough to see things as they are is an absurd notion that we have to let go of, if anybody really holds that notion. It's the idol worship and looking up to heroes as the ones who have it figured out and know what's best for us, and that always falls. We always fail when we let other people dictate what's important for us, especially if we don't agree with it in our hearts. But I think the important thing to take away here is that seeing yourself is never going to be easy. And anyone who thinks that they do, or anyone who tells you that they can see themselves clearly and they understand themselves, they're wrong, because you're constantly changing and learning. Every time I interact with somebody where it is unfavorable, every time I have a discussion that leads to an argument, let's say, I sit back and I analyze it and I ask myself, how can I do better next time to either, not get into certain subjects that irritate a certain person, or to not argue with somebody online about a subject that I don't even really care if they believe or not. A good example would be a lot of the conspiracy theories. In my early days on YouTube, I would argue for or against many of these conspiracy theories and get into heated debates that would last days with people. And after I realized they're not worth the time to argue with, discussions are better, then I would try to hold a discussion. If a person didn't want it, I'd walk away from it. And that saved me so much time and effort in trying to prove myself. A good example would be the video I posted of contrails the other day around here. As it turned out, there was a heavy fog in Seattle, so they were circling by the PDX, the Portland airport's right over here, and I'm in flight traffic. I knew I would get a bunch of comments about chemtrails and people saying things like, you just don't understand, they're real. And I don't really have the time anymore to go back and say, yeah, I spent 2 years documenting wind and weather conditions, weather patterns, moisture in the air, time of the year, filming and documenting contrails and watching how they break in certain places over the Columbia Gorge, starting to understand the troposphere and the atmospheric layers, and it taught me a lot about the world. But it also showed me that, 99% of the trails you see in the sky are indeed condensation trails. But there are still people who want to insist that every persistent contrail in the sky is barium or aluminum. And I used to argue these points back and forth, because for years I was for it, and I'd argue for it. And then I was like, no, I'm just trying to show you now that I don't believe in this anymore, and I don't care to argue it. My point here is that by giving up on wasting time arguing, you give people time to think. So if somebody posits their opinion or what they believe to be truth, whether it be, and conspiracy theories were the perfect example, and I posit my truth, both of us walk away with the seed planted. The idea is, if that seed is fertile, it will grow. If not, it won't. But nobody's going to convince somebody to change their opinion overnight just because they see things a different way. And this is important because a lot of people try to change others because they think they have some self-awareness now that they never had before. Like, oh my God, I've realized it's all about life. It's not about material possessions. And then they give away everything they own, and they try to convince their friends to do the same. Oh, you don't need any of this worldly stuff. I'm going to go off and live in a cave, and then they come back thinking this ain't for me, right? That's just a very, unlikely example, but to get my point across. Another would be somebody who just decided they're going to go vegan all of a sudden. And then the whole world has to go vegan. Everyone knows at least one. somebody who decided to go vegetarian or vegan, and all of a sudden every post they have is about being vegan, how vegan they are. Every time they talk to you, they're like, oh, you eat that? Ooh, you eat beef jerky? It's like, yeah, I like meat. Tough shit. I'm a meat eater, all right? I eat a little bit of meat here and there, and that's my choice, so fuck right off. And that's pretty much the attitude I have towards vegans. You know, I understand your plight. I understand the need to protect the earth. I don't eat tons of meat and hamburgers at McDonald's, but I'm not going to never eat an egg again or never drink milk again just because somebody else says it's bad for me, or, you know. And that's an important aspect, because so many people are suckers for what other people are telling them. And there's always a news story to confirm or deny something that's good for you or bad for you. And you just learn that your viewpoint's going to change a lot. So try not to be so firm in what you think is true. In other words, our realities, our self-awareness is very limited to our tunnel vision of our reality, which means the experiences we've had, how we grew up, the people we've interacted with. You know, what else can I say? You know, we're all victims of circumstance. We're all products of our environment. If we weren't, humans would have never survived this long. In other words, we have to adapt to the environment that we grow up in. And for some people, it's the desert. For some people, it's the mountains. For some people, it's the urban jungle. And we wonder why people have so many different opinions on things. It's because of our environment. And that's okay. Because what works for you might not work for me. It's kind of like, a good example would be firearms. So many people are opposed. They say we need to just get rid of guns altogether because we've seen so much gun violence. And others who are like, no, everybody should have a gun and everybody should always carry a gun. Those are the extremes. In the middle, people like me who say, hey, people in the country need a gun to fend off wildlife or intruders, so be it. I'm not going to say that everything needs to be one or the other. There is a gray area there. And so many people, with their own self-awareness, they think that I know what's best for everybody. And they're all full of shit. There's nobody who knows what's best for everybody. And there's so many cocksure people out there who want to tell you what you should and shouldn't do. And let me say, if you're a human being with any sort of sense, you were born with the ability to distinguish what's right from wrong, and be careful not to let other people sway your opinion of who you are. This is how we get people who get broken down by control freaks who want to dominate everybody else. So, like I said, don't ask why we are the way we are. Just ask, why do we want to change it? And if not, and that goes back to what I said about me being stubborn sometimes. I tried for a long time to overcome my stubbornness in some situations and my impatience, say when I'm driving or whatnot. It took me years to realize that that's part of who I am. That, in other words, A can't exist without B. There has to be a certain amount of impatience to be into research and to be deep into certain things. It's just how it is. I can't separate the two. And I don't want to. I just want to be who I am. And I'm learning to be comfortable with who I am. And that's all I'm trying to do, is inspire others to be comfortable with who you are. If you're an asshole, of course that's a different story. You better stop being a dick. You will get your feedback. You know, what else can I say? You know, if everybody on my channel here was telling me I'm a complete self-righteous jerk and everything was you know, I said was bullshit, then I'd have to rethink my strategy in life. But getting feedback from people is important, and you do get stuck in an echo chamber sometimes. But as long as you're not being extreme, you're better off having a little bit of, I don't know. There's always going to be jerks out there who are just going to want to poke holes in everything you say. What else can I say? I mean, it's not worth your time to fight off the trolls and the monsters and the haters. Yet, you should always stand up for yourself if somebody's trying to bring you down. And that's how I feel about it. So, be self-aware, be self-critical, but don't let it go too much, you know, to your head, because we really can never see ourselves fully. We have to get a picture from those around us as well. And if we fight that, we'll just continue to suffer, because it's the all of humanity that really understands the whole of humanity, if that makes sense. But it probably doesn't. Doesn't make sense to me either. I'll talk to y'all later. Thanks for listening. Be well. Peace out.